What would it feel like to hear the sound of your own scream swallowed by the night, while the only witnesses are the animals tearing into your flesh? What if the very person who vowed to love you, protect you, was the one who dragged you to that place? In a forgotten corner of America, long before the newspapers dared to print the truth, there was a farm where the pigs ate more than scraps. They ate secrets. They ate silence. They ate Catherine O'Brien. Why was this story never written in history books? Why did the law look away? And why, more than a century later, does her name still haunt the soil where she vanished? Because the truth of what happened here is so grotesque, so unthinkable, that it was buried alive, just like Catherine herself. The story begins not with Catherine herself, but with the land that surrounded her. The countryside of late 19th century Missouri was a place of contradictions. Fertile fields and wide skies masking lives defined by hardship, secrecy, and survival. Farms stood miles apart, their houses modest wooden structures, their barns and pens built more from necessity than pride. Life was not about comfort. It was about enduring, scraping through the lean seasons and hiding your weakness from neighbors who might turn it against you. In this world, even family was not always safe, for greed and desperation could eat away at trust as surely as rust ate iron. Pig farms dotted the region, and those who raised hogs knew the peculiar and horrifying truth: pigs would eat anything. Corn husks, kitchen slop, bones of small animals, even flesh. It was a fact whispered in tones both practical and macabre, a knowledge passed from farmer to farmer without sentiment. What was waste for one creature became survival for another. But to those with darker imaginations, that truth held another meaning, a way to erase what should never be found again. To understand the horror of Catherine O'Brien's fate, one must first step into that world, where the ordinary rhythms of farm life could conceal the most monstrous acts. Catherine was not born to wealth, but she was not destitute either. Her family carried with them a small inheritance, enough to give her a dowry, enough to ensure she would not be cast adrift in poverty. She married young, like many women of her time, and her choice of husband seemed at first respectable enough. He was strong, capable, known to be ambitious. But ambition, when soured by misfortune, becomes desperation, and desperation, when left unchecked, becomes greed. This was the rot that slowly consumed the man Catherine once trusted. From the outside, their farm was unremarkable. Wooden fences stretched around the pens, a barn sagging under the weight of years, and a modest home that seemed like any other. But within those walls, the air grew heavier with each passing season. Catherine's husband carried debts that mounted like storm clouds on the horizon. Small loans taken from neighbors, promises made in town that were never fulfilled, rumors of gambling and reckless ventures that drained what little they had. Catherine may not have known the extent at first, but she felt it in his temper, in the way he paced the floors at night, in the hollowness of his promises. Neighbors began to notice changes as well. He was often seen lingering near the pig pens after dark, watching the animals with a strange intensity. It was not the ordinary gaze of a farmer checking livestock. It was something colder, calculating. The pigs, restless and noisy in their muddy enclosure, seemed to reflect his own agitation. Some later claimed he spoke to them, muttering under his breath, though whether this was truth or embellishment is impossible to say. What is certain is that he came to see in those animals more than sustenance. He saw an answer. Catherine, for her part, remained dutiful. She kept the home, tended the garden, and tried to maintain appearances. But she began to ask questions when her small savings dwindled, when coins she had set aside for cloth or sugar disappeared without explanation. Her husband's silence was damning. He avoided her gaze, changed the subject, or snapped at her with sudden cruelty. For Catherine, these were warning signs, though she could not yet imagine the scale of the danger she faced. She was living with a man whose mind had crossed the threshold between frustration and plotting, between despair and resolve. The cruel genius of his scheme lay in its simplicity. In that era, women often vanished without much investigation. A wife might be said to have run off, to have visited relatives, to have succumbed to illness far from home. Records were thin, lawmen overstretched, and neighbors reluctant to pry too deeply into another household's affairs. He knew that if Catherine disappeared, questions would be few and answers fewer still. But the greatest risk was a body that could be found, a body that could tell the truth. That, he decided, was a problem the pigs could solve. It was a spring evening when the first act of betrayal began to take shape. The sky burned with the fading light of day, and the air carried the heavy scent of earth after rain. Catherine was called out to the pens under the pretense of fixing something, a broken latch, a feeding trough in need of mending. She trusted him enough to follow, lantern in hand, unaware of the fate waiting in the shadows. What passed between them in those final moments is lost to history, but one imagines her confusion, her sudden realization, and the sheer terror that followed. Neighbors later remembered hearing something that night. High-pitched cries carried on the wind, indistinct but unmistakable as human. Yet no one came. In that time and place, it was easier to turn away, to convince oneself that the sound was nothing, that it belonged to the wild, not to one of their own. Fear, apathy, and the unspoken rules of privacy bound the community in silence. When Catherine was gone, her husband wasted no time weaving a story. He claimed she had gone to visit family, or perhaps grown tired of the marriage and fled. The vagueness of his account shielded him. Who could argue? Women did leave. Trains ran, letters were lost, journeys undertaken without warning. It was plausible enough to silence official inquiry, especially when no body was ever recovered. Without a body, there could be no crime, only whispers, only suspicion, and so Catherine O'Brien vanished. Her life consumed not just by the frenzy of starving animals, but by the indifference of the world around her. Her name faded from official record, reduced to rumor and folklore. Some believed the tale was exaggerated, a rural legend meant to frighten children or shame unfaithful husbands. Others insisted they remembered the lantern, found shattered near the pen, its glass stained dark against the soil. For them, the horror was real, undeniable. The silence that followed was perhaps the most chilling part of all. The sheriff asked no further questions. The neighbors spoke in hushed tones, but never loudly enough to be heard in court. The husband continued his life, though some claimed he was never the same again, haunted by what he had done, or perhaps emboldened by the knowledge that he had gotten away with it. In that silence lay complicity, a community unwilling to face the darkness at its edge, content to let it linger like smoke over the fields. Catherine's story, whispered and half-forgotten, stands as a grim reflection of her time. A woman's life could be erased, her suffering dismissed, her disappearance explained away with ease. Her husband's greed, his debts, his restless obsession with the pigs in his pen, all converged into an act of brutality that should have shocked the world. Instead, it was buried, not in the earth, but in the silence of history itself. Catherine O'Brien's life before the horror was marked by a kind of quiet endurance that was common among women of her time. She was not celebrated in local newspapers, nor did her name carry weight beyond her household, but within the narrow world of farm and family, she had a place of dignity. Born into a family of modest means, she carried with her into marriage a dowry that was more symbolic than lavish. It was a token of stability, a reassurance that she would not be entirely dependent on her husband's fortunes. That dowry, and the promise of financial security it represented, would later become the very spark of her downfall. Her marriage was not unusual for the late 19th century. Women were expected to marry young, often choosing men who appeared capable of tending land and providing for a family. Catherine's husband, at first glance, seemed to meet these expectations. He was strong, hardworking, and spoke of plans to expand their small farm. Yet behind his ambitions lay a hunger that went far beyond crops and livestock. He wanted wealth, recognition, and the comforts denied to him in youth. The land he owned was never enough. The coins in his pocket always felt too few, as debts gathered like storm clouds. Catherine found herself tethered to a man whose ambition turned to desperation with alarming speed. It began with small financial troubles, a missed payment here, a delayed purchase there. At first, Catherine dismissed these as ordinary struggles of farm life. Droughts, pests, and poor harvests could sink even the most careful families into debt, and she had faith that things would improve. But her husband's troubles did not stem only from the soil. Rumors drifted into town of gambling debts, of reckless wagers made in taverns, of promises that could not be kept. Each whispered story carried Catherine's name by association, casting shadows on her reputation even as she struggled to maintain appearances. At home, the strain was harder to conceal. Catherine noticed the subtle but unmistakable signs. her husband's absences at odd hours, the short temper that erupted over trivial matters, the way his eyes lingered on her small locked box of coins. She began to hide her savings more carefully, tucking them away where she thought they would be safe. But she soon discovered that locks and hiding places meant little to a man determined to take what was not his. More than once she confronted him about missing money, her voice quiet but firm, only to be met with silence or a sudden flash of anger. These confrontations left her shaken, but they also revealed the depth of his obsession. To Catherine, her husband's behavior was troubling but not yet terrifying. She saw him as a man burdened by financial woes, perhaps reckless, perhaps dishonest, but not someone capable of cruelty beyond words. Yet those around them began to notice darker signs. A neighbor once remarked that he had seen Catherine's husband standing at the pig pen long after dusk, staring into the shadows as though the animals themselves whispered answers to him. Another claimed to hear him muttering about debts and inheritance as he leaned against the wooden posts, his eyes fixed on the restless hogs churning the mud. These stories spread slowly, part gossip, part suspicion, but each piece added to the growing unease that surrounded the farm. Catherine may have sensed something too, even if she could not name it. The man she had married seemed to drift further away from her with each passing day, his silences heavier, his movements more erratic. He no longer spoke of planting or harvesting, no longer shared even the simplest thoughts about the future. Instead, he lingered by the pens, paced the floors at night, and stared at her with an intensity that felt less like affection and more like calculation. She likely told herself it was stress, that the debts and disappointments of farm life had unmoored him, but deep down she must have felt the chill of something more sinister. The community's silence only deepened her isolation. In those days, a wife's concerns were rarely taken seriously beyond her own household. To question a husband's integrity was to invite scandal, to risk shame and whispers of disloyalty. Catherine may have confided in a friend or relative, but if she did, their advice would likely have been to endure, to trust that her husband would right himself in time. The social order of the era left her little room to maneuver, binding her to a man whose descent into darkness was accelerating. It was within this fragile context that the true danger began to crystallize. Catherine's dowry, though modest, represented money her husband could never fully control while she lived. It was a safety net tied directly to her existence, and in his eyes, it became an obstacle. The cruel irony was that the very provision meant to protect her became the reason she was marked for betrayal. Her husband, cornered by creditors and consumed by greed, began to view her not as a partner, but as a problem to be solved. And in the twisted logic of desperation, her absence promised a grim kind of salvation. Those who later pieced together fragments of the case believed the planning began weeks before her disappearance. Her husband's visits to the pig pen grew more frequent, his muttering darker, his eyes restless with a kind of fever. The pigs themselves, powerful creatures capable of devouring nearly anything, became his chosen accomplices. He knew that in their hunger lay the perfect concealment. No grave to dig, no body to discover, no evidence to link him to a crime, just silence. And silence was the one resource he knew his neighbors would provide. Catherine, caught in the tightening noose of her husband's obsession, could not have known the full extent of his design. Perhaps she sensed danger in the way he looked at her, or perhaps she still believed he was simply a troubled man lost to his debts. The truth is unknowable, but what is certain is that she stood alone in her fear. The community that might have offered her protection instead looked away, unwilling to intervene in what they considered a private matter. In that silence, her fate was sealed. Her husband's greed was not the sudden spark of a single night, but the slow burn of years, a steady corrosion of morality under the weight of want and envy. By the time he acted, he had already stripped away the humanity of the woman he once promised to cherish. To him, Catherine was no longer a wife or a companion. She was a possession whose value could be measured in coins, and whose disappearance could erase the debts that haunted him. The farm that had once been their shared home became his stage, and the pigs, restless and hungry, became the instruments of his betrayal. This was the world Catherine O'Brien inhabited in the final days of her life, a world where love had soured into calculation, where survival was gambled away, and where her very existence stood in the way of a man's twisted idea of freedom. By the time the year reached its midpoint, the mask Catherine's husband had worn for so long was beginning to slip. The community still saw him as a man beaten down by debts, a husband whose temper ran short, but they could not see the full extent of the darkness taking root inside his mind. Catherine, however, lived with him in the silent hours of night, and it was then she noticed how far he had drifted from the man she had once married. He spoke less of crops and more of schemes. He stopped seeking solutions and instead grew obsessed with escape. He had reached a place where he no longer cared about repairing his fortunes honestly. He wanted release from the crushing weight of debt, and he wanted it by any means available. It was not just financial ruin that loomed over him. There were men in town who were growing impatient. A creditor, known for breaking bones rather than taking IOUs, had been seen outside the tavern speaking his name with venom. Gambling debts were harder to hide than farm debts, and whispers spread like wildfire. He knew it was only a matter of time before those debts came calling, and he had no way to pay them. The land could not be sold quickly enough, and the neighbors had already grown suspicious of his requests for loans. It was in this crucible of desperation that his mind twisted further, shaping a plan that was as grotesque as it was calculated. To Catherine, these shifts came in fragments. He grew more restless, pacing the floor with muttered curses. She noticed the way he avoided her questions about money, the way his eyes narrowed when she tried to bring up her inheritance. What had once been a comfort between them, the knowledge that her dowry offered security, now became a wedge, a reminder of what she possessed that he could not control. She saw the bitterness in him when he looked at her, a bitterness that seemed to suggest her very existence was an obstacle in his path. The change was not sudden. It unfolded slowly, creeping in like rot beneath the floorboards, until one day she realized the man she lived with was no longer her husband, but a stranger calculating something in silence. The pig pen became his sanctuary. At dusk, when others retreated inside, he lingered by the wooden fence, staring at the restless animals churning the mud. Neighbors, curious and wary, sometimes caught glimpses of him there, his figure lit faintly by lantern light. One recalled later that he stood unmoving for long stretches, as if entranced, his gaze fixed not on the animals themselves but on the possibilities they represented. For him, the pigs were more than livestock. They were a tool, an eraser that could wipe away the one obstacle between him and a future free of his debts. He began to feed them more aggressively, watching how quickly they consumed scraps, bones, anything placed before them. Each feeding was a rehearsal in his mind, each frenzy of hooves and jaws a confirmation that his plan would work. Catherine could not ignore his growing detachment. The silence between them stretched longer, broken only by sharp words when she pressed him about missing money or the state of their farm. She may have believed he was slipping into madness under the strain, and in a way she was not wrong. Madness and greed are difficult to separate, and in him they became indistinguishable. His eyes carried the wildness of a man cornered, and though Catherine may not have known it, he had already begun rehearsing her disappearance in his thoughts. The community, too, sensed unease but said little. It was not uncommon for households to fall into hardship, for marriages to sour under the weight of poverty. In that era, what happened inside a home was considered private, even sacred, and few dared to intervene unless blood was already spilled. This silence offered him cover. He could plan without fear of intrusion, knowing that neighbors might gossip but would never step across the line to interfere. The debts grew heavier, and the visits from creditors more threatening. He could feel the walls closing in, every knock on the door a reminder that time was running out. In his mind, Catherine's dowry was no longer just money. It was freedom. If she were gone, if her absence could be explained away with a plausible story, then that inheritance could become his salvation. He convinced himself that her removal was not just necessary but inevitable. The logic of desperation is a twisted thing. It turns murder into duty, betrayal into necessity. Catherine's own awareness of her husband's decline is harder to reconstruct, but fragments survive in the whispers that followed her disappearance. A friend recalled that she had confided vague worries, speaking of her husband's coldness, his strange fixation with the pigs, and the way he seemed to study her as though she were a problem he meant to solve. Whether she understood the full scope of the danger is uncertain, but her unease was clear. She was living with a man whose love had soured into resentment, whose mind had been consumed by obsession. The pig pen in those days was not just a place for livestock. It was a place of eerie possibility, its mud thick with rot, its air heavy with the stench of decay. To stand at its edge at night, hearing the guttural squeals of hungry animals, was to be reminded of how thin the line was between the human world and the animal one. Catherine's husband knew this well. He had learned, like all farmers, that pigs would consume flesh without hesitation, that they would leave behind nothing but scraps of bone too small to identify. This knowledge became the cornerstone of his plan. He did not need to dig a grave, did not need to risk discovery. He needed only to ensure she entered that pen and did not return. In those final weeks, his paranoia grew. He watched Catherine closely, gauging her routines, waiting for the right moment when suspicion would be least likely. He rehearsed lies in his mind, explanations for her absence, reasons she might have left. He crafted stories about visits to relatives, about marital disagreements that might justify her sudden disappearance. Each story was prepared not to convince the world, but to buy time, to ensure that no one would search too deeply. For Catherine, the walls of her life must have felt as though they were tightening. Her savings dwindled, her husband grew more withdrawn, and the house that had once offered security now felt like a cage. Perhaps she thought of leaving, of seeking refuge with family, but such choices were not easily made by women of her era. Travel was costly, scandal more costly still, and loyalty to a husband was often valued above survival. She may have clung to hope that he would recover, that the man she once loved still lingered beneath the bitterness. But the truth was starker. The man she once knew was already gone, replaced by something colder, something calculating, something waiting for the right moment to strike. The community looked on, whispering but silent, as her husband's obsession reached its peak. They saw him lean against the pig pen as though it were a confidant, his eyes dark with thought. They heard the sharpness in his voice, the weight of his debts, the bitterness with which he spoke of Catherine when he thought no one was listening. But they said nothing, and in that silence, Catherine's fate was sealed. The plan had taken root, nourished by greed and fear, and it was only a matter of time before it was carried out. The evening that sealed Catherine O'Brien's fate was like many others in the countryside. Its stillness interrupted only by the sounds of livestock and the whisper of wind moving across the fields. To a stranger passing through, nothing would have seemed unusual. A farm at dusk, lanterns flickering inside homes, families retreating indoors after the long day. Yet within the O'Brien property, something darker was unfolding. Something rehearsed in the restless mind of a husband who had decided that murder was his only salvation. He had prepared himself in silence, feeding the pigs more heavily in the days before, stirring their hunger until their squeals became louder, more frenzied. He lingered by the pen each night, testing its latch, studying its wooden frame, ensuring that when the moment came, nothing would fail. The plan, grotesque in its simplicity, relied not on elaborate contraptions or conspirators, but on the primal appetites of the animals he had raised. Pigs were relentless, indiscriminate feeders, and he knew that within hours they could consume what no man should leave behind. It was not only the erasure of Catherine's body that appealed to him, but the silence it promised. No grave to be discovered, no corpse to testify, no evidence that could convict. Catherine herself walked blindly into the trap. That day she had tended to her household duties as she always did, unaware that each step brought her closer to a night that would not end. The air carried the damp scent of rain that had passed earlier, and the soil outside the pig pen was soft, clinging to boots with every step. As darkness fell, her husband suggested she bring the lantern and follow him out to the pens. He spoke of a broken trough, a task he claimed required her hand, though she might have wondered why it could not wait until morning. Trust, even when frayed, has its own momentum, and Catherine carried the lantern into the night without realizing. She was carrying the only light that would bear witness to her final moments, accounts from neighbors, who lived near enough to hear the farm. That night suggests that Catherine's voice rose. Sharply at some point, a startled cry carried across the fields. The sound was brief, cut off too soon, as though the night itself swallowed it. Those who later recalled it said the pigs had grown restless, their squeals high and urgent, mingling with the unmistakable tone of human distress. Yet no one came. No one dared step onto another family's property in the dead of night. In those days, cries were often dismissed as quarrels, accidents, or the ordinary chaos of farm life. A woman's scream, though chilling, was not enough to compel intervention. Silence was the shield behind which her husband acted. What transpired in those final moments can only be pieced together through fragments of rumor and the logic of his plan. Catherine, carrying her lantern, likely leaned over the pen to examine what he claimed was broken. He may have shoved her with sudden force, catching her off balance on the slick earth. The lantern, jarred from her grasp, shattered as it struck the ground, its flame dying out in the mud. In that instant, she was plunged into darkness, and the only light left came from the pale moon above. The pigs, startled and frenzied by the sudden intrusion, surged toward her. What followed was horror. Screams torn from her throat, hands grasping for purchase on the wooden frame, the chaos of hooves and teeth and mud swallowing her as her husband stood above, watching. Those who lived nearby would later insist that they had never heard such sounds. It was not just the cries but the silence that followed, sudden, absolute, broken only by the continued squealing of animals whose hunger had been turned upon flesh. The night was heavy with it, and though neighbors whispered of what they had heard, none would admit to seeing, none would claim to know. Silence once again became complicity. Her husband emerged from the pen hours later, his clothes soiled with mud, his face pale and strained. The pigs had done their work. Nothing of Catherine remained but fragments too small, too scattered to betray what had happened. He smashed what remained of the lantern into the dirt, grinding the glass into the soil with his boot. By the time dawn arrived, there would be no trace of Catherine O'Brien, no body to bury, no evidence to recover. Only absence explained away by lies carefully rehearsed. When asked the following day about his wife's sudden disappearance, he claimed she had gone to visit relatives, or perhaps had left out of dissatisfaction with her marriage. His story shifted depending on who asked, but always returned to the same conclusion. Catherine had chosen to leave. In that time, women did vanish, sometimes fleeing unhappy marriages, sometimes traveling long distances with little notice. His explanation, though weak, was plausible enough to deflect suspicion. Without a body, without proof, the community was left with only whispers. But whispers grew. Neighbors recalled the sound of her scream, the restless noise of pigs that night, the broken lantern found near the pen. They noticed how quickly he returned to the tavern, how swiftly his debts seemed to quiet in the days after. A man once cornered by creditors now carried himself with uneasy calm, as though some hidden weight had been lifted. Yet none of these whispers reached the sheriff in a way that demanded action. The absence of a body left him shielded, and the reluctance of the community to intervene ensured that Catherine's fate would remain unspoken in any courtroom. Her husband's grisly plan had succeeded, not because it was clever in design, but because it exploited the silence of the world around him. In a society where women's voices were often dismissed, where neighbors avoided entanglement in the affairs of others, and where poverty bred secrets thicker than blood, Catherine's screams were drowned not only by the squeals of pigs but by the indifference of those who might have saved her. In the aftermath, the farm continued as though nothing had happened. The pigs were fed, the fields tended, and Catherine's absence explained away with casual lies. Yet for those who had heard the sounds that night, for those who had seen the broken lantern lying in the mud, unease lingered. Some avoided the farm altogether, unable to shake the memory of what they suspected had occurred. Others whispered in hushed voices, careful never to let the words carry beyond trusted company. The story remained alive only in fragments, passed from one generation to the next as a warning, a legend too grotesque to be entirely dismissed. Her husband, though spared the justice of the courts, carried with him the mark of what he had done. Some claimed he grew more withdrawn, others that he grew emboldened, convinced of his own cleverness. But all agreed that he was never the same. His eyes, once restless with the hunger of ambition, now seemed haunted, as though he saw in every shadow the ghost of Catherine O'Brien. The pigs, fattened on their terrible feast, became his nightly tormentors, their squeals echoing in his dreams, their jaws tearing not only at flesh but at his sanity. And so the plan, though it gave him freedom from debts, chained him to a legacy of whispers and suspicion. He had succeeded in silencing Catherine's body, but he could not silence the land itself, nor the neighbors who carried the memory of her scream in the back of their minds for years to come. The farm, once a place of labor and survival, became a site of dread, its pig pen a monument to greed and betrayal. The darkness of that night seemed unnaturally heavy, as if the sky itself had conspired to cloak what was about to unfold. The O'Brien farm lay quiet beneath the weight of the moon, its pale light falling across the fields and barns, glinting faintly off puddles left behind by the afternoon rain. Yet within that silence there was tension, a current of dread that Catherine could not sense but her husband felt keenly. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind so many times that now, as it drew near, it carried a strange inevitability, as though he were only walking through a door that had long been waiting for him to open. He led her toward the pig pen with a tone that was almost casual, a voice softened by false concern. The wooden boards creaked beneath their boots, and Catherine, holding the lantern, stepped carefully to avoid the mud that clung thickly to the ground. She asked him again why the task could not wait until morning, but he answered with a vague insistence that the trough would collapse if not repaired at once. She did not press the matter. To her, this was another small duty, another inconvenience of farm life that had to be endured. She had no reason to suspect that her husband's mind was elsewhere, fixated not on the wood and nails of the trough, but on the moment he would shove her into the pit. The pigs were restless even before they reached the pen, pacing, squealing, their hunger sharpened by the meager meals they had been given that week. They smelled flesh, sweat, and fear. Catherine raised the lantern, its light flickering across the muddy enclosure, illuminating the rough shapes of animals moving within. She crouched to inspect the trough, leaning forward, her attention fixed on the cracked wood that he had deliberately loosened earlier to make the pretense believable. In that instant, as she bent forward, he saw the opportunity open before him. As simple as breathing, the shove was swift and brutal, delivered with the full force of a man who had carried hatred in his heart for far too long. Catherine cried out, startled and confused, her body pitching forward. The lantern flew from her grasp, the glass shattering as it struck the wet earth, its flame snuffed out instantly. Darkness surged around her, broken only by the pale gleam of the moon. She fell into the pen with a sickening thud, her hands clawing at the wooden boards as she tried to pull herself up. But the pigs, shrieking and frantic, surged toward her. Their weight pressed against her body, their jaws snapping at her arms, her legs, her face. Her screams cut through the night, piercing and raw. The sound of a woman who understood too late what fate had been chosen for her. She called his name, pleaded with him, but her husband stood above, gripping the wooden frame with white knuckles, his face twisted not with pity but with grim determination. He had steeled himself for this moment, silenced his conscience, convinced himself that this act was necessary, that her suffering was the price of his survival. The pigs did what hunger compelled them to do, their squeals drowning out Catherine's voice as they tore into her flesh. The neighbors, lying in their beds, stirred at the sound. A few sat up, uneasy, whispering to one another. Some thought it was only the chaos of animals, a disturbance common enough in rural nights. Others admitted later that they recognized the sound of a scream, human and terrified, carried on the wind. Yet none rose from their beds, none crossed the fields to investigate. In those days, to intrude upon another man's land in the middle of the night was unthinkable, and fear of what might be found was enough to keep them silent. Catherine's cries went unanswered, swallowed by the indifference of a community that preferred not to see what lay in plain sight. The struggle did not last long. The pigs, driven by frenzy, were merciless. Catherine's cries faltered, breaking into ragged gasps before fading altogether. The only sound left was the gnashing of teeth, the grunts and squeals of animals locked in a frenzy of consumption. Her husband leaned against the pen, his breath uneven, his heart pounding not with sorrow but with a terrible relief. It was done. The burden of Catherine's presence, her resistance, her threat to his fragile pride and ambition, all of it had been silenced. He stood in the moonlight, watching as the animals reduced her to nothing, erasing the evidence of his crime with grotesque efficiency. By the time the frenzy subsided, there was little left that could speak of Catherine O'Brien. Shreds of fabric clung to the mud. Fragments of bone vanished beneath hooves, and the earth was stained dark where her body had fallen. The pigs rooted through it all, indifferent, their hunger sated. He climbed into the pen with a stick, scattering the remains further, pushing them into the mire, ensuring that even the faintest trace would be swallowed. Then he climbed out again, wiping his hands on his trousers, his face drawn and pale in the cold light. For hours he remained there, sitting on the edge of the pen, his thoughts a storm of triumph and dread. The reality of what he had done pressed down on him, yet he told himself it had been necessary. Catherine had been an obstacle, a weight he could not carry. Now she was gone, and with her disappearance came freedom. No creditors would claim his land through her, no disputes would drag his name through shame. He would tell the neighbors she had left, that she had abandoned him. In a world where women vanished every day without explanation, his lie would be enough. When dawn broke, he rose and began to tidy the evidence of the night. He collected the broken lantern, scattering its shards in the mud, grinding them beneath his heel. He washed his hands and face at the pump, though the smell clung to him, an odor of blood and iron that no water could scrub away. The pigs, bloated and silent now, lay in the muck, their bodies heavy with what they had devoured. He fed them again to mask their hunger, to give the appearance of routine. By the time the first neighbor passed along the road, he was already at work in the fields, his posture calm, his face carefully composed. That morning, when asked about Catherine, he claimed she had gone to visit relatives. Later, when pressed, he hinted she had left him, dissatisfied, perhaps planning never to return. Each version of the story shifted slightly, but the core remained the same. Catherine was gone by her own choice. Without a body, without proof, his words were enough to quiet suspicion. The neighbors, though uneasy, accepted his account, or at least pretended to. Those who remembered the screams of that night held their tongues, unwilling to provoke conflict, unwilling to bring the law into what might only be rumor. And so Catherine O'Brien was erased not only by the teeth of animals, but by the silence of those who might have spoken for her. Her husband continued his life on the farm, walking the fields, feeding the pigs, passing neighbors on the road with a nod and a hollow smile. Yet the memory of that night lingered in the air, in the soil, in the whispers carried from one household to another. The farm bore its secret like a scar, and those who passed it could never quite shake the image of Catherine's scream cutting through the dark, a sound that had demanded justice, but received only silence. The morning after Catherine's disappearance was eerily ordinary on the surface. The roosters crowed, smoke rose from chimneys across the valley, and neighbors went about their daily tasks with little outward sign of alarm. Yet beneath that calm, there was an undercurrent of unease, for the cries heard in the night had not gone unnoticed. Some described them as animalistic, a clash of pigs fighting over food. Others admitted in hushed tones that they had heard something more, the unmistakable sound of a woman's voice crying out in terror. But to speak such suspicions aloud was dangerous. In a small rural community, accusing a man of murdering his wife was not only a matter of law, but of honor, a breach that could fracture trust among families who depended on one another for survival. And so silence became the first act of complicity. Her husband played his role with calculated precision. To the earliest visitors who stopped by the farm, he explained that Catherine had gone to see relatives, perhaps for an extended stay. He spoke with an air of irritation, as though she had left without warning, abandoning him to the burdens of the farm. It was a story that contained just enough plausibility to be believed, or at least tolerated. Women did sometimes leave, whether driven by hardship, mistreatment, or simply the lure of another life. That she had done so suddenly raised eyebrows, but without evidence to the contrary, it was easier to accept his account than to question it. Days passed, then weeks, and Catherine's absence grew harder to ignore. No letters came from her supposed relatives. No word was carried back by travelers. When neighbors inquired again, her husband adjusted his story, suggesting she had quarreled with him and gone off to start fresh elsewhere. He hinted at her being dissatisfied, restless, perhaps even unfaithful. These words, carefully chosen, turned suspicion away from him and onto her memory. Instead of a victim, Catherine became a deserter in the eyes of some, a woman who had chosen to abandon her responsibilities. His lies twisted her reputation, reshaping her identity to suit his needs even as the truth of her fate lay rotting in the mud of the pig pen. Still, the whispers persisted. A farmer who lived a mile away claimed he had heard her scream, clear and sharp, cutting through the night like nothing he had heard before. His wife urged him to let the matter rest. They had children to feed, land to tend, and no business meddling in another man's affairs. Another neighbor, passing by the farm on the morning after, swore he smelled something strange near the pig pens, a stench that lingered in the air, heavy and metallic. He told no one at the time, not even his own family, but years later the memory would return to him with clarity that haunted his sleep. Catherine's family, too, was left in the dark. When they wrote letters inquiring about her, her husband deflected with excuses, claiming she was unwell, then that she had moved on, then that he had not heard from her at all. The lack of consistency should have betrayed him, but correspondence was slow and news often unreliable. Weeks turned to months, and in the absence of definitive proof, her family's grief was smothered by uncertainty. They could not accuse without evidence, and they could not find evidence without risking open hostility from the man who now controlled what was once Catherine's home. The authorities, such as they were, barely stirred. In rural areas of the time, law enforcement was distant, underfunded, and hesitant to intervene in domestic matters unless a body was produced or a witness came forward. Catherine's disappearance was troubling, yes, but not unprecedented. Women who vanished were often written off as deserters, their fates left to speculation. Without pressure from the community, the case never rose to the level of formal inquiry. Her husband counted on this inertia, and he was right. The pigs themselves, unwitting accomplices, erased nearly every trace of the crime. What little might have remained was scattered, buried, or hidden away. A fragment of fabric, a broken button, a patch of soil stained darker than the rest. These were all that hinted at what had transpired, but no one dared to look too closely. And so the earth swallowed Catherine's presence just as the animals had consumed her body, leaving behind only the vaguest impressions of a woman erased. Still, memory has a way of seeping into the soil, of clinging to the air. Though no one confronted him openly, her husband could not escape the sideways glances, the quiet conversations that stopped abruptly when he entered a room. He carried on with his farm work, walked into town for supplies, greeted neighbors with a stiff nod, but beneath the surface, he was marked. His smile never reached his eyes, his hands trembled when he lifted a glass, and his temper grew sharper when questions lingered too long. Those who spoke with him often remarked later that he seemed haunted, though whether by guilt or fear of discovery, they could not say. Over time, Catherine's story slipped from fact into folklore. Parents warned their children not to wander near the O'Brien farm after dark, whispering that the pigs there had tasted human flesh. Travelers passing through were told cautionary tales of the woman who vanished, her cries carried away by the wind. Some said her ghost roamed the fields, her voice faintly audible in the rustling of the corn at night. Others claimed her spirit lingered near the pig pen, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover the truth. These stories, half believed, half embellished, ensured that Catherine was never fully forgotten, even as her name disappeared from official record. What was most damning was the silence of those who might have spoken. The neighbors who heard the screams, the family who questioned but never pressed, the authorities who dismissed the case as a private matter, all contributed to her erasure. In protecting themselves, they betrayed her. Their fear of scandal, of reprisal, of disrupting the fragile order of their community, allowed her husband's crime to stand unpunished. The pigs may have devoured her body, but it was the silence of others that devoured her justice. For her husband, life went on in the hollow way it always does for those who bury their sins beneath layers of lies. The farm endured, though it was never prosperous. He aged, his body bent by labor, his eyes sunken by years of suspicion. Some claimed he was plagued by nightmares, waking in the night drenched in sweat, his cries carrying across the fields just as Catherine's once had. Others said he drank heavily, muttering incoherently to himself, his words lost to madness. Whether guilt consumed him or he simply carried on without remorse, no one could say for certain. But the land remembered. The O'Brien farm became a place avoided after sunset, a patch of earth where crops grew thin and animals grew restless. Visitors often remarked on the unease they felt, as though unseen eyes watched from the shadows. The pig pen, though rebuilt and repaired many times, was always regarded with suspicion. Its boards creaked louder, its mud seemed thicker, its air heavier than any other on the farm. To those who believed in such things, it was cursed, a site forever stained by betrayal. And so Catherine O'Brien remained, not in body, not in grave, but in whispers, in warnings, in the uneasy silence of a community that chose not to act. She became both victim and legend, her story serving as a dark reminder of what greed and silence can conspire to destroy. Her husband may have rid himself of her presence, but he could never rid himself of the weight of what he had done, nor of the shadow she left behind. Years passed, and the O'Brien farm remained a place that people spoke of only in cautious tones. Time should have softened the horror of Catherine's disappearance, but instead it sharpened the outlines of the tragedy, leaving her memory etched into the soil like an unhealed wound. Children who had once overheard their parents whisper of screams in the night grew into adults who repeated the story with the same unease, as if the act itself had been imprinted into the collective consciousness of the region. Catherine had no grave, no headstone, no marker to affirm her existence. Yet her presence lingered more potently than those who rested in well-tended plots of earth. She lived in rumor, in fear, in the quiet understanding that something unspeakable had taken place and had never been brought to justice. Her husband aged in the shadow of what he had done. The vigor that once made him appear capable and ambitious gave way to a stooped figure, worn down not just by labor, but by the gnawing unrest that trailed him wherever he went. Though no court ever indicted him, no sheriff ever clamped a hand on his shoulder, his life became its own punishment. His farm never prospered as he imagined. Crops faltered in the fields, livestock sickened, debts continued to nip at his heels. It was as if the land itself refused to yield to him, as though Catherine's spirit clung to the soil, denying him the fortune he had traded her life for. There were those who swore they saw him speaking to the pig pen in the still hours of night, his voice low, trembling, carrying words no one could fully make out. Others claimed he avoided the pen altogether, allowing it to fall into disrepair, its boards sagging, its mud thick with weeds. Yet whether he haunted the place or shunned it, the effect was the same. He could not escape the sight of his crime. The pigs, those unwitting accomplices, became symbols of his guilt. To feed them, to hear their grunts, to catch their eyes in the pale light of dawn, was to remember what they had done to Catherine at his bidding. The neighbors never forgot either. For all their silence, their complicity, they could not erase the memory of that night's cries. The sound had carved itself into them, resurfacing when the wind howled through the trees or when an animal's shriek echoed across the valley. In church pews, at market stalls, along fences where they traded news, the O'Brien case lived on as a ghost that refused to settle. They did not name it openly, for to accuse was to acknowledge their failure to intervene. But the story passed in lowered voices, carrying the same chill generation after generation. By the turn of the century, Catherine O'Brien had become less a woman of flesh and blood than a cautionary tale. Parents warned daughters about marrying men whose hunger for wealth outweighed their sense of honor. Husbands whispered of her fate to mock wives who they believed nagged too much. Children dared each other to run past the farm at night, listening for the phantom scream that some swore still drifted from the pig pen when the moon was high. What had begun as an act of violence fueled by greed transformed into a myth, the kind that both concealed the truth and preserved it in fragments. The irony was bitter. Catherine, silenced so brutally, had her story twisted into a kind of folklore that stripped away her humanity, even as it ensured she would never be forgotten. To some, she was a restless ghost, vengeful and cold. To others, she was a nameless victim of farm life brutality, reduced to a whisper that warned of what men might do when debt and greed pressed too heavily. Rarely was she remembered as she truly was, a woman who had lived, worked, and endured before she was betrayed. In this way, her erasure extended beyond the physical, into memory itself, reshaped and distorted by those who had failed her. Her husband eventually died. Alone, his body found in the farmhouse he had once shared with her. Some said he muttered her name in his final hours, clawing at the air as though fending off something unseen. Others insisted he died silent, his face twisted in a grimace of fear. When he was buried, the service was sparse, attended by few, his grave marked only by a simple stone. No mourners spoke of him fondly, no eulogies painted his life in warm colors. Instead, his death was regarded with relief, as if the earth itself had reclaimed a debt. But the story did not end there. For decades, locals avoided the property, some swearing it was cursed, others insisting they felt Catherine's presence there, restless and watchful. New owners came and went, each leaving sooner than expected, unable to shake the unease that seemed to hang in the air. The farm became a place of speculation for outsiders, journalists, and folklorists, who stumbled upon the tale and sought to untangle truth from myth. Yet no investigation, however thorough, could recover what the pigs had consumed or what silence had buried. The Catherine O'Brien case thus endured as a testament to the darkest aspects of human nature. Greed that devours love, betrayal that silences the innocent, and a community's willingness to look away when intervention might have cost them comfort. It revealed not only the brutality of one man, but the complicity of many. For Catherine's death was not merely the work of her husband's hands, but of every neighbor who heard her scream and turned back to their bed. Her tragedy lived on because it was more than one woman's story. It was a reflection of how entire communities can fail the vulnerable, preferring silence to justice. Even now, her name carries weight. A reminder of the price paid when greed is left unchecked and when victims are abandoned by those who should have spoken for them. Catherine O'Brien's story is not merely a fragment of dark history. It is a warning that echoes through time. And though her body was lost to the hunger of animals, her presence has never been fully erased. She lingers in the whispers, in the unease of those who know her story, in the chill that runs down the spine when one imagines the sound of a scream carried across a darkened field, a scream that was heard but never answered. As you've just heard, Catherine O'Brien's story is not simply a fragment of rural tragedy. It is a haunting reminder of what greed and silence can destroy. A woman vanished, consumed not only by animals but by the indifference of her neighbors and the failure of justice. Her screams were heard, but no one came, and that silence echoes still, a century later. These are the kinds of forgotten histories that reveal more than just crime. They expose the darker corners of human nature, the truths we prefer not to face. Stories like Catherine's force us to ask unsettling questions. How often has greed twisted love into betrayal? How many victims have disappeared because their voices were dismissed, their pain ignored, their pleas unanswered? If this story gripped you, unsettled you, or made you think twice about how history is written and how it is buried, then you belong here with us. We uncover the shadows, the hidden truths, the stories that others would rather erase. By subscribing, you ensure that these voices are not lost again, that each forgotten name has the chance to be remembered, no matter how chilling the tale may be. So I ask you now, subscribe to this channel, join this community, and keep the memory of Catherine O'Brien alive. And in the comments below, share your thoughts. What struck you most, what disturbed you, or what questions still linger in your mind? Because silence buried Catherine once, let's not allow silence to bury her again.